Okay, so I just, as a little preamble, wanted to say that it's really fantastic that I think most of the papers that have gone before me today and yesterday have kind of foregrounded a lot of the things that I thought I was going to have to explain. So some things I'm taking not necessarily as a given, but I know that you guys, those of you who have been here, have heard about it already. So if you have any clarifications on anything that I just skipped past, we can talk about that at the end. But thanks to everyone who kind of did that work for me, because that's really helpful, actually. The paper that I've got is drawing particularly sort of from modern ruin studies. So a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about comes from that field. I'll describe it very briefly, but I'm considering the way in which specifically modern or contemporary urban ruins and decay, as they appear in video games, contribute to meaning-making practices and possibilities of play in circumstances where making sense of the game is facilitated by the wider contextual meaning of ruin landscapes or ruinscapes depicted. And it's an approach that's particularly focused on what I would kind of frame as 3D navigable worlds and games that are sort of ostensibly set in contemporary cities, so cities that we know of, cities that we can recognise, depicted in a state of hypothetical or future implied ruination. So in terms of this idea of modern ruins, I've just got a few really quick examples of the kinds of things that, so you can get a handle on exactly what I'm talking about. So this is, you know, contemporary-ish buildings in a state of decay, basically. So they're not ancient ruins, they're not classical ruins. They can include sort of relics and remnants of other things. They don't have to be buildings. And then in terms of this idea of hypothetical ruin, I've got one example that's sort of concept art and one example that's in play in games. So that's just sort of what I'm referring to as I go along. So I'd sort of start by saying that grappling with the notion of representation in games presents an immediate problem in terms of how we understand the image itself as a conveyor of meaning. And so I think I'm extending on some of the discussions that we've already touched on about how this kind of meaning arises. So as Graham Kirkpatrick notes, quote, "Computer games are not representational systems in the straightforward sense that their meaning content can be read off from their visual, narrative or textual elements." So that's, you know, they're not directly representational necessarily. At the same time, we can't make any conclusions that all ruins in all games would mean the same thing to all people or are inherently meaningful. So it's always about this kind of possibility of mobilising meaning. Whether or not that takes place is up for question. So, as Ian Burgost states, even though games are no mere trifle, they are also not automatically rich, sophisticated statements about the world around us. So this sort of kind of problem there. So both Burgost and Kirkpatrick and others frequently remind us that the visual or textually readable content of many titles is not only ambiguous in terms of any set meaning for players collectively, which I think my position is that that's kind of true with all media, but also that a great deal of content for games is abstracted for purposes that don't necessarily correlate to outcomes of play. So that sort of narrative devices, creative design, hardware limitations, you know, those things can help play, those things may have nothing to do really with how the game is played. And as was sort of briefly mentioned yesterday, it's important to say that particularly hardcore players become almost immediately desensitised to much of the visual content in a game that isn't required to be in play for the game to function as a game. So a lot of this stuff is sort of, you can do the kind of work that I'm going to do in interpreting meaning, but at the same time, whether that's actually in play during a game, to sort of use a word I think King and Kravinska say, is really up for debate. I think that's an interesting debate to have. So my position is that I think it's rare for visual content to bear no influence on the gameplay experience, and I think ruins are no real exception to this. So in considering meaning making in games, it's necessary to move beyond the first level encounter, the basic recognition of what you're seeing, and consider how landscapes of decay and fragmentation are already replete with functional and complex meanings well before they are put to use in games. So from a design perspective, the use of ruins in games is deeply entwined with the generation of meaning because, as one developer has stated to me, sort of semi-anonymously, they simultaneously have the capacity to affect the feel of a game in terms of the atmosphere that they can convey. And they work together with the disjointed construction of in-game architecture to make it appear more plausible or logical that it's blocky or fragmented. And so this might be one of the reasons why ruins are so common to games, because they actually make it seem less obvious that there are problems with the architecture in terms of actually mapping it to a 3D kind of structure. So to excavate the meaning potential, the broader meaning potential that I'm talking about of abandoned and derelict contemporary cities in games, I think it's necessary to understand both urban and ruin imaginary through which we comprehend modern ruins, and also the wider field of modern ruin studies. So this idea of an imaginary, I'll just go over this really, really quickly. Andreas Huyssen considers the urban imaginary to be, quote, the way city dwellers imagined their own city as a place of everyday life, but also the binary imaginary of glittering metropolitan centres contrasted against haunting spectres of crime, corruption and decay. So that both of these things, the sort of ideal city and the negative sides of the city, are embodied in this imaginary. And so building on that, Steve Pyle includes image, representation, emotional qualities and fiction to understand the construction of the urban landscape, the city of experience and the urban imaginary. So this urban imaginary isn't something that you can see and touch, it's kind of structures how we anticipate or operate or feel or understand or know the city, what the city is as a concept. So to imagine the ideal city is to also invite the counter-imaginary of the city in decline. And so that's what I would sort of refer to as an urban ruin imaginary. So the emerging field of modern ruin studies can be divided between popular and art world mediations that tend to reflect more traditional histories of the sublime, so classical and romantic ruins, as well as urban-focused discussions of real-world ruins in the contemporary period, so the kind of pictures that I just showed you guys before. So modern ruins as a general category includes abandoned and derelict buildings, brownfield, industrial decay, rubble from demolitions or earthquakes, burnt out shells of factories, mills, warehouses, any of those sorts of things. And in many readings, modern ruins extend to any fragmentary or threatened, maybe liminal landscape of the contemporary period. So it becomes this quite broad category, but it is crucially not ancient ruins, so non-old ruins, basically. And so these kinds of ruins, the ruin imaginary persists, as ruin theorist Brian Dillon suggests, because ruins are always available for a variety of meanings. And I think this is one reason why developers are keen to make use of them in games and why they become so common, because they have this kind of potential for any kind of meaning. And so this is this sort of almost meta idea that I'm going to go on with. So from a modern ruin studies perspective, the ruins of a recent past can be considered as a model for meaning production, with the ruined city a hollowed out signifier of the end of meaning itself. So to quote Helen Schonler, the ruin is a ruin precisely because it seems to have lost its function of meaning in the present, while retaining a suggestive, unstable semantic potential. Ruins say everything and nothing all at once. It's kind of the gist of ruin theory. Video games set in ruins exploit such an absence of meaning and abundance of potential, but they also reproduce nearly every cliche about ruins in the process. So they don't necessarily say anything substantial about ruins. They might be very cliched sort of representations on the level of representation. So the ruins of The Last of Us are designed to appear just like the city that we know, so Boston or Pittsburgh, or maybe the quintessential American city. In a hypothetical time when the city has been forever changed by a catastrophic occurrence, producing an epic and navigable spectacle of decay which looks much like the post-apocalyptic visions common to both science fiction, film and urban exploration photography. And so this is how we kind of know what we're seeing in the game, because it immediately looks familiar to us and we know how to categorise it. So the ruins depicted are at once recognisably banal, the everyday sights of any cities, the boarded up windows and collapsing buildings of the urban decay aesthetic, but they're also highly aestheticised grand visions of the ruinous demise of the city as a sort of conceptual spectacle, a sort of spectacular sublime that's particularly prominent in the sweeping vistas populated with a landscape of ruins, which tend to sort of bookend each level in The Last of Us, with recognisable locations dotted amongst a generically crumbling urban landscape. So we have these specific ruins and these generic ruins. And so to kind of contrast the way which the interpenetration of these different imaginaries works, we've got one picture here, which is a picture of Varosha in ruins. It's a photograph that Paul Dubrazcek took. And then you've got this kind of image from The Last of Us. I'm not necessarily comparing them as images, more as sort of imaginaries or concepts, conceptual frames. So as an example of the multiple registers across which ruins signify or communicate, although this isn't the primary concern of the whole discussion here, it's been noted previously by Daniel Vella that ruins in games are the natural home of embedded narrative, particularly in their past-oriented presentation. So games themselves, especially those set in ruins, can appear as chronotopic worlds in which temporal events are transcribed in space. I think Dunstan Lowe's Always Already Ancient also points to the historical temporal quality that's inherent in the way that we conceptualise the concept of ruination itself, so potentially on a trajectory. But I think at the same time, and this is more of the content that comes in from ruin studies, the predominance of ruins in games is not only for ease of narrative or space-time organisation. This is because ruins don't just belong to the sublime or the melancholic. They also serve the Gothic and horror genres for centuries and have a contemporary form in popular culture. So they're no less significant as conveyors of the uncanny and the incomplete as they are of a linear tale of human progress told in the rise and fall of civilizations, which implies the sublime, to quote Daniel, whole beyond the grasp of the imagination. So one way of seeing this ruination is as a naturally narratological form driven by perceived historical chronology and imbued with transience. But observing the same qualities, the ruin can also, particularly in a contemporary or hypothetical form, be oriented towards the ultimate fragmented forms of the present era. So for Walter Benjamin, one of the century's foremost critical urban theorists, writing between two great wars, pondering ruination didn't conjure the great mind grappling with the unknowable, which is much more typical of the sublime. And it wasn't about the weight of time or transience either. For Benjamin, it was about the perpetual shock and catastrophe of modernity and the destructive, not constructive gaze of the fractured spectator. And I also quote in the last lines of Rose Macaulay in a book that she wrote in the 1950s called Pleasure of Ruins. The sublime potential for wholeness presented by long-standing ruins is far harder to detect in new ruins, which ultimately speak instead of our fearful and fragmented age, no matter how much we may wish to detect the romantic beauty of the sublime in their jagged forms. New or modern ruins in games can be read through this lens, so understood as simultaneously inviting the sublime gaze, but rebutting it as new ruins, or ruins of places that exist in the contemporary world. And so two examples of ruinscapes in games that I think allow us to think through these different registers of ruination and how ruins themselves work to sort of mediate meaning are Fallout 3 and the 2008 RPG Hellgate London. So on the surface, both of them kind of display an influence of the sublime because that's how we understand ruins. So the ruined Capitol building in Fallout 3 is an iteration aesthetically of the fall of Rome, reminding us of the time in which, and to quote Christopher Woodward, the gilded Capitol languages in dust and all the temples of Rome are covered with spiders' webs. And that's sort of attributed to St. Jerome, but I think it's sort of, you don't really know if that's what he said. But so this is just me comparing these two ideas. And at the same time, though, the little book, The Art of Fallout 3, the world is described as varying between, quote, classic post-apocalyptic and vaguely Orwellian, while the, quote, neoclassic buildings that pervade the heart of the capital are ever present. And so there's a lot of different kind of borrowing going on here. So Fallout 3 refers to the sublime to the extent that all ruination is framed by it, but the represented ruins are equally informed by more contemporary aesthetics of decay, and particularly those of pulp culture and science fiction, and by the dominant imaginary of Washington as a kind of place, so the urban imaginary of Washington as the American capital and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I don't need to explain a lot of this stuff to you because this is how we think about these places, this is how we operate, so you probably recognise the sort of tropes that I'm talking about. So in Hellgate, although we see the near exact replica here of Gustave Doré's etching The New Zealander, which shows a figure looking out across the future ruins of London and which aesthetically point to other imagined ruins, so here are the other kind of imagined ruins that I think are probably informing the way that Hellgate London shapes London. We are also presented with scenes of ruination that are far more akin to the sad new ruins of Rose Macaulay's account, reminiscent of the bombed-out cellars and streets of post-war London, both in-game and in the associated cutscenes and concept and cover art. So that sort of vision is more gritty and unheimlich than sublime, I think. So in the way that we know modern ruins through a wider imaginary of ruin, such ruinscapes in games are haunted by a canon of ruination, pointing beyond their recognisable representation as architectural remnants to more complex significations at the level of symbolism, metaphor and allegory. Yet they simultaneously occupy a position as the ultimate cliched expression of mortality and transience. So these debates, I don't know if you've come across them, about things like ruin porn in urban photography, this sort of cliche of ruin, which is a prescribed message that's repeated so often as to be almost meaningless, rendering ruins the contradictory expression of presence and void. So that's materially and in terms of linguistic signification, so it's again on multiple registers. And this is because, as Robert Ginsberg notes in his colossal book on the aesthetics of ruins, the original object, the real material ruin, even in the flesh, is intricately symbolic, so it's imbued with complex and time-worn meaning that we can't get away from. So you don't just come to ruin and go, that's a thing over there. It's sort of overlaid with all these, centuries of meaning. So with this in mind, ruins in games can perhaps best be understood, and this is my way of trying to grapple with it conceptually, as tropes, deployed as a shortcut to meaning, as a means to communicate representationally, yet with a potential depth of content that's well beyond the immediate kind of context. And again, it's really worth noting that this isn't naturally or always functioning in play. You can play without this kind of stuff. So it's sort of more about how it may work. So tropes in this sense are modular packages of meaning reconfigured in new formations using broadly recognisable arrangements which are influenced by genre, form and so on. And I'm really summarising this in the smallest amount of space possible. They can point well beyond themselves as complex metaphors or allegories, but tropes are also ways of communicating that make use of our cliched and simplified understandings of the world. So you might already see that there's a theme going on here, because that's also a bit like how ruins work, right? So as an example of the operation of tropes in video games, Arseth and Bakker in a Digra paper on ludic zombies, I think maybe 2011, or maybe 2013, refer to the ubiquity of zombies in games as a trope. And this is really quite useful for me because zombies and ruins frequently co-occur in games. I think there's reasons for that. I don't have time to discuss it. And both zombies and ruins are reminders of mortality, the putrefying corpse that persists. So both are also subject to the same caveat that meaning might be imminent, but it isn't a given. So this need not limit the potentially complex social and cultural relevance of the zombie figure and associated ideas as a trope, which possesses the capacity to embed the allegory of, quote, the commodification of human bodies and the threat of consumerism to human culture within the game, because across games of different genres, the zombie trope is inherently fused with suggestive potential. So whether or not that happens is another question. So Arseth and Bakker refer to Walter Benjamin through the work of Shaviro to frame the zombie trope as unfulfilled allegory, as always embodying the impossibility of total meaning. So Graham Kirkpatrick's reading of Benjamin's allegorical perception further suggests that games overall have a similarly allegorical manifestation as simultaneously mere machine automated emblems in a work bereft of signification and hovering over a vertiginous excess of potential meaning. So the form of games, therefore, enables the doubling of allegory and multiplicity of both deep and shallow potential meanings, and that's also a quality that can be attributed to ruins in the allegorical mode. So you might see where I'm sort of going with this. Not that games are necessarily ruins, but ruins as a model of meaning work with games. So on the level of games as allegories for contemporary society, the synchronicity between ruins and games can be mapped to the fragment. Meaning in games operates by deploying constructed units and exploiting their meaning content as detached emblems, marshalled into complementary arrangements as needed. In their operations, games manifest a multitude of discrete visual components to produce playable meaning, collections of image-dominant representations that circulate in and out of play, which can be productively analysed as a composite, so the playable environment or maybe the ruinscape, or down to a single unit, so maybe a zombie. And so to sort of get into my conclusion, I'd like to offer a kind of provocation that I'm still thinking through, so that these graphical images of ruins, particularly in a navigable form, construct space. So not necessarily as allegories for space, but as, to quote James Ash, the spaces that images themselves produce. And so James Ash is a media geographer, and he evokes non-representational theory to claim that while the image content of games signifies at the level of representation, so we're not going to get rid of representation or representational thinking, such images collectively also possess their own spatial dimension that's not virtual, digital or simulated. It's a type of space that we intercept bodily, that we experience as space. So this spatial dimension is not a lazy evocation of the generalised notion of virtual space in games, nor a specificity on the level of depicted rooms or levels that stand in for some kind of idea of real-world space. Ash's assertion that there are spaces that images produce could be seen in terms of abstract space, such as that which philosopher and sociologist Henri Lefebvre would describe, that dwells in things and signs and feeds into and out of lived experience. So Lefebvre's insistence that space itself is merely a symbolic category supports the idea that video games might construct sensible meaning through images that produce spaces that we navigate, explore, traverse and so on. And this sort of relates back to this idea that I started off with the urban imaginary as well, I think. So as embodied meaning, space in the game world is produced and operates just like any other space, through symbols and signs, images, fictions and imaginaries, through lived experience and phenomenological perception, by humans living out their lives and in the moment of encounter. And so here is my kind of idea of an example for how that might work, if James Ash is indeed correct, and I'm still thinking about this. So while segments of Call of Pripyat in particular are recognisable as the abandoned city of Pripyat, which is situated within the current exclusion zone around Chernobyl, the most widely recognisable site, which is the Decaying, or arguably I guess, which is the Decaying Amusement Park with the red and yellow Ferris wheel, is viewable mostly from a distance. So it's not actually a playable landscape in the normal course of the game in Call of Pripyat. The sense of distance is spatial, not as a recreation, but as something we understand dimensionally to be far away. Although you can access the wheel in Shadow of Chernobyl, I'm fairly sure, it's affected by electro-anomalies and serves no real kind of purpose in the game. So it's not about playability. It's, again, something to kind of look at that has a sort of sense of distance. So the wider representational power of this particular image provides an interesting insight into the spaces that images might produce beyond the game. The image has such currency and is so recognisable that it was created in some detail for promotional purposes and to be glimpsed at a distance in the game. And this is significant in that it actually reflects the material experience of visitors to the site who can approach but should not touch the heavily irradiated metal structures, including the Ferris wheel itself. So that's a picture I've taken of the Ferris wheel on the left, and is affected primarily by the relationship between the avatar and the distant image, producing a simultaneity of space that transcends the game world and feeds into and out of the space that is the real-world site of the Chernobyl disaster, a site which gains currency and valency and thus broader meaning, not only due to the nuclear disaster, but as a ruinous landscape itself. So it's known through tropes of ruination as well. So to describe this as virtual space might be easier than understanding this depiction as part of the space of exclusion that defines the physical site. But this, I think, would be disingenuous in this particular case. I'm not suggesting this extends everywhere, because this space, though encountered separately, is not conceptually isolated from the space upon which it was modelled. So moreover, to understand this only as a sort of flat representation of space ignores the touristic practice of visiting Chernobyl that's emerged following the release of the game. And it also ignores the fact that the images from this game actually alter the abstract conceptual space of Chernobyl Pripyat in the public consciousness, or at least, in relation to those who are engaging in play cultures, whilst also reflecting, again, primarily through images, the dominant imaginary which constructs the mainstream framing of this space, the widely circulated photographs of the site, and in particular the iconic Ferris wheel. So to conclude, an in-game ruinscape plunders a vast archive of real and imagined ruins, a familiar set of tropes and ways of thinking about the city, in which in the process of carrying meaning in order to construct a meaningful setting through the visual, also produces its own spatiality and contributes to the production of the imaginaries which frame wider cultural meanings out in the world, whether tropes on a basic level or on the allegorical level of master tropes which tell us about life and experience through the higher orders of meaning embodied in images of ruination. Thank you.
Now let's see if there are any questions from the audience. Any questions or comments?
Thank you. It was very impressive and persuasive analysis of ruins. Most of what you talked about, and I think you mentioned this explicitly at the end, is that the use of ruins to convey meaning was very similar, if not exactly the same, in games as elsewhere. And I was just wondering if there's not any unique properties to games and the use of ruins in games. That's an issue I'd like you to address. And the second one, it also struck me while you were talking that there are actual sort of games in ruins. I'm thinking of Second Life, for instance, which at one time was mentioned as often as Wittgenstein is today, but we don't see that anymore. And if you go through Second Life, it's sort of a game in ruins in a sense, and I thought you might pick up on that at least to some degree. So those 2 points.
And I think they actually kind of intersect on that level that I was talking about, the sort of multiple valency of registers that ruins kind of work on. So I think this is kind of what I'm trying to think about in my PhD, which is that, what is it that might be unique about ruins in games? So doing away with the first big question is whether or not they're ruins. For the purposes of brevity, they're ruins. I think what might be interesting is actually on this level of multiple signification that they can be, that the way that games are constructed themselves is ruinous. It's fragmentary, it's always in parts. There is no whole game that's actually a real functional, they're never fully formed, if that makes sense. They're kind of in pieces. And so I think that may actually be what's useful, because ruins are really prevalent in games, and I think I've done some developer interviews, and the way that I'm seeing that is because ruins kind of help to get around the problem that games are ruinous in there. So I don't know if that quite answers that question. But just trying to think about your second, what was the second part of your question? Yeah. Well, and so that would then be a further, you would be putting another layer on top of the game as ruins as ruins, and then so you've got abandonment would be the kind of register along which that works. And so I think someone else has pointed out, is it Verm or whatever, that has actual things that get ruined in games, whether or not that's ruins. And then there's also other things to do with abandoned online worlds and that kind of stuff where nobody goes there anymore. And so there's a whole bunch of different ways in which, you can think about ruins in games. So I think that's something, if you're moving away from the flat representation, what other ways can you see games as having this relationship to ruins? So I think that's...
Okay, we have a question over there.
Thanks for that. You mentioned Robert Ginsburg's work on ruins, and so he looks at the tradition of talking about ruins within Western culture, and he argues that there have been these two ways of looking at ruins, the romantic and the classical. And both of those are, in a sense, framing the ruin as a relation to this lost original unity. But then there is something which both of those not account for, which is the fact that a ruin in itself, semiotically, is a contested space, right? It speaks to the original unity. It also speaks to the agent of ruination, whether we consider that, time or, some other external agent. And this, in terms of ruins in games, I wonder how you feel about the potential of that in terms of structuring the space semiotically, in terms of structuring the space in terms of competing forces being equally represented. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
I think it's interesting because I think that the potential problem is that I'm not sure if we can talk overall about all kinds of ruins in games. So I think there's actually two different theoretical positions you could have on that, is that all ruins in games must somehow work on the register of, say, the classical or the sublime in order to be deciphered as ruins at all, I think. And I feel like that's maybe more semiotic then, in a sense. But if you sort of take it to this experiential side that maybe I'm thinking about as well, to do with fragmentation and embodied sensations of disintegration, then it starts to maybe make meaning on a slightly different plane, which can be more shallow in a sense than that, because it's not necessarily operating on the very deeply grounded, cliches, but grounded kind of theoretical aesthetic potential or things that ruins possess. It might be moving in a sort of different direction, that it's about fragmentation and the possibility of knowing the ruin as a whole. It never was a whole. It can't. That's a fallacy. It's a, So I don't know. I'm not. That's sort of another problem in response to your question. So I don't know. Does that sort of answer what you were thinking about? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. I have no quarrel at all with sort of the specific examples you give, but I think that there might be some, worries, at least I have, sort of about that ruins can mean anything and everything. I think that kind of statement is always a little bit problematic. But what I'm thinking about is sort of that games are ruins. I think that when you talk about fragments and incomplete wholes and stuff like that, I think there are other equivalent sort of things that you might invoke there that yes, they are incomplete and all that stuff. That doesn't mean that they're ruins. And sort of just as a thought experiment, if I were sort of the type of person that was sort of inculcated within Nintendo's universe, for instance, I wouldn't which is basically another way of saying that this is genre specific to some extent, I think. They're kind of like incomplete playgrounds or something that you couple together or whatever, but I'm kind of worried that you can pick sort of a couple of metaphors there that would be just as useful in a way. So that so maybe sort of that there are some arrows going in one or two directions, but if you sort of use equivalency signs between games and ruins, I think you get into trouble, basically.
And so I think you've hit the whole entire sort of problem with, modern ruin studies as a project, understanding ruins as being the essence of fragmentation, which is our whole experience of the world, right? So that's kind of a problem, because it's not only is it non-groundable, it's just become so abstract as to mean almost anything.
Right.
But I think, on one hand, you've got this kind of parallel where we're having this debate now about whether games mean anything, and that's the same thing that happens in ruins studies. Ruins mean everything and nothing, games mean everything and nothing. So I'm sort of trying to draw that parallel to make a wider comment about maybe how aesthetics itself kind of works. Maybe that's where I'm going with it. But I think to think about so ruins themselves, and this is well established in some of the aesthetic theory, particularly about the sublime, but ruins themselves are a kind of special category. You might not say of an object, but they sit in the same place as like maps. Sort of decay and disintegration kind of is in the same space in a lot of theoretical frames as language. And so those are the kind of ways I think where on one hand it blows it really so broadly that it's troublesome. But also allows you to find these little intersections. So if I say ruins mean everything and nothing, but then I say, but at the same time we see games as having that problem, does that kind of help you resolve that in any sort of sense that you're having?
Not at all. I just think it compounds the problem, basically, because I don't think that any individual game or formula or genre means everything and anything. I mean, if you look at particular sort of genre systems, they do have very specific properties. And I think if you look at Nintendo's portfolio, for instance, you'll see much less shooting people in the head, much less zombies, much less this and that.
Yeah.
So it's just basically that's one way of curtailing this type of totalitarian analysis in a way. And I don't think that it's necessarily a problem, but I think it's an issue.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It's an issue. And I wonder if it goes back to what Daniel's kind of asking on the level of, do we sort of understand ruins to have those semiotic kind of potentials or not? And I think the other thing with this as well is that we're dealing here with images, and images are also one of those things that could also be ruins, as per a sort of ruin studies framework as well. If you look at Walter Benjamin's kind of stuff that predates ruin studies, but talking about the origin of German tragic drama and Baroque allegoric models for understanding the world, the image itself is a ruin. So it is just this spiral that goes round and round and round, I think. Yeah, so that's what you've picked up. But.
Okay, and maybe we have time for a last question over here.
Yeah, I want to follow up on this question. What is the specificity of ruins in games as opposed to ruins in other media? And it somehow seems to me that these ruins are something like an anchor of hope to escape something that is typical for games, that you always have to be productive, that you have to run, that you have to move, that you have to get forward. And somehow they meet something that in Freudian terms you would call the lust of the Todestrieb, of the death drive, as opposed to this erotic drive that is most of the time prevalent in games where you have to build up, be some kind of SimCity entrepreneur that makes things bigger and stronger and more lasting. So could that be that there's a psychological motif hidden there that says, well, okay, I want to get out of the game. I want to have something opposite to the dictate of speed and success.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting point that you sort of put forward there, because particularly if you're talking about the way that ruins might operate in that sort of beyond the game kind of sense, as operating. I mean, you look at film Wim Wenders and things like that. You look at the kind of way that film suggests that I mean, I don't know if it's really, I mean, the uncanny is a good way of thinking about it, but I don't know if it's really the revulsion of decay or something like that, but trying to grasp that repulsion maybe to kind of make the game operate in a certain way. Is that what you're sort of thinking of, how they're maybe making use of what is kind of an aesthetic, but also a suggestion of something that you don't want to embrace, that sort of fascinates you and repels you at the same time? Is that, or have I taken it totally the wrong way? Yeah, I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Emma.